Hello, welcome to American Government. Today we're talking about Chapter 3, Federalism and American Political Culture. 3 points I want to make in this talk. First of all, federalism is one of the 3 principles that underlie the entire US political system. First is representative democracy. Second is the separation of powers. The third is federalism. Second point is that federalism is a kind of vague concept which came out of the framing of the Constitution and has been defined in the American context through the Supreme Court and in practice through the relationships that have developed over the decades and centuries between the federal government and the state governments, local government. Third thing is, we'll be talking a bit about chapter 4 of the book as well here, which is that the book identifies five main elements of political culture, which I'll be talking about. First of all, define federalism. The book defines federalism as a sharing of power. That is, the American system is one in which there is a central government, a federal government, there are state governments, and then there are local governments at the city, county level. And all 3 of these levels of government have their own powers. They also share some powers, and they have powers that only they can exercise. Go back to the framing of the Constitution. You may remember that Alexander Hamilton and Madison both believed that the federal government should be very powerful. They wanted a strong central government to regulate commerce between the states, relations between the states. They wanted a strong central government that could mobilize a powerful military and engage in international diplomatic relations. Thomas Jefferson was among those who favored a weaker central government and thought that the states should retain a lot of their power. Keeping in mind, as Jefferson argued, that the 13 states actually preceded the United States, right? And that was the name of the country, is the United States. And so the idea was for Jefferson that the state governments were closer to the people and they had unique circumstances, specific kinds of things they would have to deal with. And so they should have more power than the federal government. Okay, in the federalist system, it comes through the compromises between the framers of the Constitution. Basically what they do is they enumerate certain kinds of powers that are only powers of the federal government, things like making treaties, declaring war, doing those kinds of things. Enumerated powers means they're basically listed. They're listed in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which I'll get to in a second. Reserved powers are those powers that the federal government does not get in the Constitution. They are reserved to the people or to the states. What we're interested in here is powers reserved to the state. Things like regulating commerce within a state. Criminal justice is a state kind of thing. Concurrent powers are powers that are shared powers. That is, they have the federal government and the states both have those powers at the same time. Things such as taxation is a concurrent power in the American system. Okay. Enumerated powers. I'm not going to go into these. Go to Article 1, Section 8 of the US Constitution. You'll see the various enumerated powers here that are laid out in the Constitution. These are powers which are exclusive to the federal government, not the state government. States can't have their own post office. States can't borrow, well, they can borrow money, that is, but they can't print their own money, their coin money. They cannot declare war. They cannot raise an army. They cannot do various kinds of things like that. So federal government can. And then there are the reserved powers. Amendment 9 and 10 of the Bill of Rights, these are the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, spell out state powers reserved to the people in the states. Amendment 9, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage other rights retained by the people. Amendment 10, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Okay. Federalism, though, what does that mean in real life? How does that shape the way we go about politics? Well, federalism in the United States system was defined through a number of Supreme Court cases, which the book lists there in chapter 3. You can take a look at the details on those. A couple of significant ones here. The McCulloch versus Maryland case of 1819. This was an early Supreme Court case when John Marshall was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. John Marshall was a very long-serving and one of the most important Chief Justices in American history, because he oversaw the court that sort of defined what was the relationship between the federal government and the state governments. Marshall believed that the government was created by the people, not by the states. And so for Marshall, government was there to serve the people of the United States, not the states of the United States. And it's reflected in McCulloch versus Maryland, which is a case in 1819, which had to do with the creation of a bank, and Maryland being the state that wanted to prevent the federal government from creating a national bank so that states could create their own banks. Well, in that case, the Supreme Court ruled that there's a clause in the US Constitution that says that the Congress can make all laws necessary and proper to enforce the Constitution. And he said the necessary and proper clause grants Congress implied powers, powers that aren't enumerated and that aren't restricted to the states, but rather are implied in the Constitution. If the Constitution says that the federal government can declare war, then that must mean the federal government can create a military. If the federal government can create a military, that must mean it can collect taxes to pay for that military. So those are implied powers that the federal government has. And so, according to Marshall, state actions may not impede the valid constitutional exercises of power by the federal government. Obergefell v. Hodges is a recent case, 2015. This is the case in which the Supreme Court, under Chief Justice John Roberts, declared that the fundamental right to marry is guaranteed to same-sex couples by both the Due Process Clause of the 5th and 14th Amendments and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So the Supreme Court has said basically that states can't interfere, because in the case of same-sex marriage, a number of states prior to 2015 had created state laws prohibiting marriage and defining marriage as a union between a man and a woman. And so the Supreme Court said that states did not have that power under the Constitution. Some states' rights theorists would argue, they argue about this thing called nullification, which is a thing that goes all the way back to the Constitution. The idea being that states, because they created the United States, had the right to nullify certain actions by the federal government. Nullify meaning they had the right to ignore them and refuse to enact them. Nullification is sort of the ultimate in states' rights power. If you think that the state has the right to just basically ignore the federal government, this has been tested in Supreme Court. It has always rejected the very idea, said, no, this is nonsense. States can't just decide on their own to reject the power of the federal government. But this is an argument that keeps coming up over and over again. And it's up right now with the case of the Texas ban on abortions, which the Supreme Court decided not to hear before it had gone into effect, but is being now challenged by the Department of Justice at the federal level. And it will come back to the Supreme Court at some point, probably in the fall, when they will decide on whether a state has the right to actually override a right that the Supreme Court has said that the American people have. Okay, federalism in practice. There's two different views about what federalism is meant in practice. David B. Truman and William Riker, these are both political scientists I mentioned in the book. Truman sees federalism as creating these separate self-sustaining centers of power, prestige, and profit, which means that each of the 50 states is a place where people can lobby their governments. They can get resources from state governments as well as federal governments. And this means that these are separate centers of power and profit for the people. And this means that there's a system then where things can be very different from state to state, because different states will enact different laws. So Texas enacts an abortion ban, while New York does not, for instance. There are three, Truman points out that there are three, or the book points out that there are three kinds of things that are part of the relationship between the federal government and the states: categorical grants, block grants, and mandates. Take them in reverse order here. Mandates are things that the federal government declares the states must do, but the federal government doesn't necessarily give the states federal funding to carry out those mandates. So a mandate might be something like environmental controls, pollution controls on cars, or distribution of medication in certain kinds of ways, something like that, funding for schools. Block grants are grants that come from the federal government. So these are from federal tax revenues, but they're given to the states to do certain kinds of things. And generally, they're not very specific. A block grant basically means there's a block of money that's given from the federal government to the state. And oftentimes it's things like you can use this for improving infrastructure and education. Categorical grants are grants that are defined by a certain category. They're for a certain particular purpose. These are grants from the federal government that usually come for specific things like improve this highway in the state, kind of a thing. All of these grants and mandates are things in which the federal government and the states negotiate their power. Federal government has the power of the money, but it's the states that actually have to carry out the projects to spend that money. So there's a constant tension and a constant negotiation, politicking is going on there. Riker has a somewhat dimmer view of federalism. He says that the main effect of federalism since the Civil War has been to perpetuate racism. That in fact, what you've got is a system in which there is no central national policy about race relations, about integration of schools, about voting rights, various things like that. And so you get differences within the states in which some states opposed the civil rights movement. Some states implemented Jim Crow laws. They've implemented more recently voter suppression laws. They've tried to outlaw abortion in various states. States also have powers that the federal government does not have, two of which are the referendum and the recall. California, for instance, right now going through a recall election to decide whether they want to keep their current governor. Now, this would be tomorrow. He's current until tomorrow. He may be voted out of power. Gavin Newsom may be voted out of power in California because of a recall, even though he has not served his full term. The federal level, you cannot do that. The president cannot be recalled by the people who elect the president. She serves 4 years term, and then they're out. Congress people serve their full term. You can not reelect them, but you can't recall them. Referenda are state ballot initiatives, which some states will, instead of having the legislature vote on bills, they'll have the people actually vote on a bill, and it will go on a ballot. It'll be going to ballot as a proposition. Again, from California, the famous Proposition 13 back in the 1970s was a proposal proposal that would limit the amount of property tax that could be charged in the state of California. It went to the people, it passed overwhelmingly, and so there's a limit on how much property tax can be charged in California by the state, by municipalities, by counties. It has had some devastating effects, but it was the voice of the people at the time. Third thing that Riker talks about is differences in regulations and standards. That is, different laws, different standards for criminal punishment, various kinds of things like that, so that one state may not have the death penalty, for instance, while another state may be executing people as fast as it can. And so this is the thing about federalism, is that it gives the states leeway to move around. Now, federalism is not a universal kind of system. Some countries do not have that. Many countries, most countries, I would say, probably do not have federal systems. They have instead a very highly centralized system in which the central government is the power, and provinces or states, if they have them, will respond to the federal government, the central government that provides all of the tax money, controls all of the taxes, sets all of the standards, declares all of the laws that apply to the entire country. England is like this. Turkey is like this, for instance. Russia is like this. China is like this. Most countries around the world, federal systems are fairly limited. The US, Germany has a federal system. I believe Brazil has a federal system. Mexico has a federal system. But most countries do not have this kind of a system. They got a much more powerful, stronger central government. Okay, that brings us to Chapter 4, an American political culture. Chapter 4 defines American political culture as a patterned and sustained way of thinking about how political and economic life ought to be carried out. That is, pattern and sustained. That means there are certain ways in which Americans think about themselves and their political system and what they expect from that political system. And sustained means that that lasts over time. It hasn't changed a whole lot over the years. It has been around since the 1700s, and particularly since for the last 100 years or so. The book says there are basically 5 main elements of the American political system. The notion of liberty. Americans are big on liberty, free speech, right to own guns, various kinds of things like that. And we take those liberties seriously. The US has probably got the strongest protections for free speech of any country in the world. Most countries limit them. There are more limits on hate speech and abusive or insulting speech. They oftentimes have laws that say you cannot teach certain kinds of things in schools. Equality is the second one. I would say in the United States, though, it's important to distinguish between equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome. Americans believe strongly in equality of opportunity, but they do not believe in equality of outcome. That is, Americans don't believe that if all people should be equal. They only believe they should have equal opportunity. And so if there is gross disparity of wealth or power or influence in the United States, that seems to be fine with Americans. Third thing is democracy. But again, as I mentioned before, what Americans think of when they think of democracy is representative democracy. Town councils, things like that, those might be direct participatory democracy, but that involves generally very few people. Very few people actually believe or participate in participatory democracy. And actually in the United States, very few people actually vote. In off-year elections, like this coming one in 2022, when there's no president running for election or re-election, voter turnout tends to be low, somewhere between 40 and 50% nationally. And if it's an off-year election, even more like a 2021 election in which there might be ballot issues like funding for the school board or for a library, your voter turnout can be in the 10 to 20% range. Over the last several election cycles for president, voter turnout has run between about 50 and 60% of all eligible voters. Not everybody who's an eligible voter registers to vote. And so, and even people who are registered, not all of them vote either. So actually you've got about 50 to 60% of eligible voters. Eligible voters make up roughly half of the population. So when you think about who elects the president, you're really talking about maybe 25% of the US population, and then half of that. So who is it that actually elects somebody like Biden or Trump as president? That's somewhere like 15% of the actual US population. 4, civic duty. Americans do believe in civic duty. And this is reflected in a whole bunch of things. Think about the Martin Luther King Day thing, which is now seen as a day for volunteerism, a day when people get together and they do things to help out the neighborhood and help out their neighbors. Americans have, I think, a strong sense that they should help each other out, particularly in times of disaster. Think about the Red Cross, various kinds of things like that. 5th thing is individual responsibility. Americans tend to be individualistic in their thinking, and they like their political system that way. Americans don't want their political system to solve people's problems. They want to do it themselves. And in general, what Americans oppose is things like mask mandates. Over the last year and a half, think about the way in which people have received mask mandates. That's part of this culture of individual responsibility. It's my responsibility. It's my right not to wear a mask. It's my right to get sick. And all these kinds of things. Americans are big on that kind of a thing. But ask yourself about some other things here. That is, what are other elements that make up the American political system? For instance, what about religion, the role of religion in the United States? Americans tend to be very religious. They are the most religious of any population of any advanced industrial economy. There's some charts in chapter 4 of the book that show how Americans think about various kinds of things, and one of them talks about their religion. Second thing is diversity. Keep in mind that racism is part and parcel of American society, and it's part and parcel of the American political system. Most people would say, I'm not racist, but there's racism in our American system, through our schools, through our workplaces, through our government, through the Constitution, through everything. It's part of the society and part of our politics. Inclusivity. Americans pride themselves as being on this kind of melting pot or salad bowl of the world, where you've got this very diverse population of people from all over the world. 193 or more languages are spoken on the streets of New York City every day. And yet Americans, particularly of late, have not been so keen on letting in immigrants or refugees, people who are escaping, say, from Afghanistan or from Iraq, have not found themselves welcome in the United States. The US government has adopted policies to keep them out. People fleeing climate change from Central America, coming through Mexico, have not found themselves welcome. Military strength, I would say, is another thing to think about in terms of American political culture. What role does the military play? We have an all-voluntary military, so very few people actually serve in the military. And yet it seems to be a big deal for Americans to have a powerful military and to think of ourselves as a militarily powerful country. And then finally, think about wealth and property. How do Americans view the distribution of wealth and the acquisition of wealth? So I said before, Americans believe in individual responsibility, and socialism or communism are bad words in the United States. And yet Americans think that they deserve a certain amount of the wealth and a certain amount of the property. They want it to be distributed. And so we have a progressive tax system, which is kind of broken down of late, but they're talking about restoring it now so that the wealthiest pay the most taxes. All right. Finally, one thing I would ask you to think about, as the book does, and that is, how would you define the American dream? That is part of our American culture, is the way in which Americans define what is America about. What is our political system about? What do we want from that political system? What do we want from being American? All right, I will leave it there. I hope you enjoy this. Take care. Talk to you soon. I can turn off the recording button here. So what happened here?